Good evening, YouTube. We're going to talk about eugenics today, but the old eugenics. And I don't mean 1800s or even the 1940s. I mean ancient eugenics, that is. We talked a lot of times about eugenics in humans, and I was looking around for some data that would show when humanity used to have eugenics, that is to say, positive selection for traits that we value, and when we kind of moved into selecting for worse things according to our values. So I've checked over some books. Gregory Clark has some good stuff. He's been looking a lot at old wills, and so when people died in, say, the 1600s, some of them left a will, and in that will they left their assets, and this gives a count of how many assets they have, and it also has a count of how many kids they had, since the will that splits the money between the kids. And so this allows you to relate the money of someone dying to the number of children. And this essentially is a wealth fertility correlation, which you can use to see how many kids people had. And so in this Suffolk data set from the early mid 1600s, you can see that there's a lot of poor people, and there's some people who are very rich. And the very rich people, they were 4% or so of the population in the first generation. Nevertheless, when you count all the kids, they were roughly 8%, roughly 5 to roughly 8. So the rich proportion is expanding. Their genes are going up. You can see the very poor people, they declined from 61% to 50%. So these people have had fewer surviving children, or fewer children to begin with. And so we know that in England in 1600s there was a selection, at least for wealth. You can plot the data in a different way. I cannot remember if this is the same data that looks like this. If you just plot the fractions with surviving sons, and there is also some data from samurai, and I don't actually need to have this on, from samurai. So these are from Japan, and in Japan, they didn't have these nice wills. Well, maybe they did, but Greg Clark did not study them in 2007. But he did study the fertility rates of the samurai, which is an elite class. And so, though we don't know exactly how elite they were definitely quite elite. And you can compare that to their fertility level to other replacement level. And you can see that the samurai people here in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, they were above replacement fertility. So they were still expanding. And at least insofar as you can do this, there's some indication that at least the samurai were also breeding faster than an average over there. And in China, you also had this because you have data from the members of the king or the queen, or whatever you say, imperial lineage. So these are the kind of kings and stuff of China, and they recorded their stuff. And you can see the Chinese birth average was down here, and this one is moderately above from 1750 or so onwards. And it was definitely above before 1740s. And so again in China you see that there was some selection upwards, but maybe not. The difference in China was probably not as big as the English average to the English rich. So it seemed that English in this period as a people, they had more or stronger eugenic selection, stronger selection for intelligence, and these related traits that make you wealthy. Again, we know at some point this reversed. It would be nice to have a kind of plot. I couldn't find a plot that just shows this reversal. Nevertheless, I found this chart from one of the books, the Greg Clark books. And here we see by the late 1800s and early 1900s, the professional class are having fewer kids than the other lower classes. And so we know that already by the late 1800s in England, the rate had reversed. So it used to be that wealthier, smarter people and so on, they had more kids, and now they have fewer by this time. So as I recall, there was another study that found the reversal is somewhere around 1850 in the UK, and this relates to the Industrial Revolution. If you have some data that is better about this, I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that in some outlying areas, like some peasants in Sweden, the reversal happened only in 1910 or so. So it depends where you're sampling people. This is England, which was a forerunner of industrialization. So the reversal was probably a bit faster over there than it was in like rural Sweden or somewhere in East Europe. Nevertheless, if you have some data about this, I'd be very happy to see these. So please post those in the comments. a different way of just looking at the this is instead of looking at these kind of plots, you can also just look at the number of surviving children, and modern here refers to roughly around 2000 if you check the footnotes, and this is the same data from the 1600s. And so we see that the rich people used to have almost 4 surviving children, whereas the poor was barely reproducing, and nowadays neither the rich or the poor are reproducing in England. They're both below replacement, but nevertheless the poor are outbreeding the rich. And so Britain as such is getting genetically poorer over time, even ignoring immigration issues. But we also know from older history that humans did evolve. So aside from these 1600s data, these 1600s data, we also know that humanity before we left Africa and so on was selecting for intelligence. We know this because the brain sizes were going up. And so we know that brain size, especially between species, is a really good measure of intelligence, especially when you residualize this for body size, right? So you get the encephalation quotient or one of these measures. And so we can see that in terms of like 10 million years ago, up until like 2.5 or so, there was some increase over time, but not too impressive. Then essentially came the early Homo sapiens, and then you had this massive growth period where the skull size and thus the brain size was massively increasing. So humanity was getting rapidly more smart, and this is where you had all the old versions of humanity that died out, the Homo erectus and so on, and eventually Neanderthals and stuff. And there's also this decline in very recent times, in the last 10,000 years or so, in brain size. I'm not exactly sure if this is also when you control for race. I would assume so, but it's nevertheless very interesting. This one has probably something to do with agriculture, and we're not going to speculate about it in this video, but very interesting. Just the final way one can look at eugenics in old history is that you can use it. You can look at tools over time, and these, of course, get more complicated over time. This is going from 2.5 million years ago to the present, and you can see back then you had this extremely primitive stone tools, and like this is this period here. So this plot starts basically here and ends up here. So you can see the technology as we go through this massive brain expansion, it becomes much more complicated, at least even in the stone tools here. Of course, later we have bows and atoll and technology that were extremely complicated, but these are extremely recent, right? Nevertheless, we know historically that humanity has selected for intelligence, but it hasn't been studied so much genetically. And that's what this new study is about, right? Because we do have polygenic scores, we do have genetic models for intelligence and education and these related traits. And so when we have all these old ancient genomes that everybody is talking about, it should be possible to just score them using our best current predictors of intelligence and then see if the polygenic scores are going up, which they should be, right? As we can see from both the historical records with fertility and wealth, we can see that with the brain size on the long span, and we can see this with the tools also in somewhat middle term. And so that's what this study did by Kuipers. I guess he's Dutch, and it's just been published in this Frontiers journal. It's basically it's based on the Reich dataset, and the Reich dataset is this one. You can go. So David Reich is this Harvard Jew professor, and he's great. And his students compile all the published ancient genomics, and you can literally just go to this website and click download and then do whatever you want with it. It's totally free in public, as it's perfect as science should be. Notice here that the current version from October 2021 is version 50. This has some significance here. So these people, they used only samples within Europe, and they used version 32 or 37, sorry. 0.2, which is, as you just saw on the website, like heavily outdated, and even half a year before this paper was published, there was a new, much larger version. And they only end up with 1,800 ancient samples, and we just saw on the website here that there are now 6,400 in their public collection, and since this is rapidly expanding, probably by the end of this year, it's going to reach, 10,000 or so. So this is really a bit strange that they use such an old sample, and of course they used only Europeans, probably because they didn't want to get any race and intelligence issues. We'll get to that later. Anyway, let's begin with their findings with the first one. So here they have standing height, which is, the polygenic score for height, which is one of the best ones we have. I don't recommend looking the first plot, because this is just like a piecewise linear regression where you essentially say each of these colored parts must have the same one just linear line. So we're going to ignore that and look at the middle one, which is a smoothing fit, and so that can show any kind of line. And essentially what we see is that there's no real pattern for standing height here in this. So essentially not much happened in these years in Europe, and then people started getting taller recently, and it may have stopped at least somewhat close to recent. And this last 10,000 years, this is the farming period. So this cannot just this is not, like, hunter-gatherers probably were somewhat taller than farmers. At least that's what we are guessing at from a lot of this other research. Skin color, I don't know if it's reversed. I'm assuming that there was selection for skin color, so I'm assuming that higher skin color is more darkness here. I didn't check their source, but I would think that is the case. We can check later. But I think that in Europe, essentially what you find when you look at the old data is that very old Europeans, kind of these proto-Europeans, they were essentially dark. They had not yet evolved lighter skin color, and this is something that got adapted earlier, later. And so that's why sometimes when you see these science news about old Europeans being dark, this is, well, I mean, it is also political signaling, but nevertheless it is also true, at least insofar as we can tell by genetics. And so that is what you see in this kind of plot. To go to their other findings, they have some more body ones here. And while these fat ones are not too interesting, I think because these the genetic models for coronary heart disease and they're not very good, so we're going to ignore them. The one we see is BMI is of interest. So we see there was not much selection insofar as you can tell from 20 data points or so at the old Stone Age here. But as you get closer to modern time, it seems to be a decline in Europe. So it seems that whatever genetics these earlier kind of hunter-gatherers had, and once you get to the farming age here, then it starts decreasing. When people go farming, they lose some of the genes that essentially bolster you or give you a buffer. And my theory about this is that it has to do when you're doing hunting and gathering. Well, there are some dry spells when you're hunting, like when you're not getting lucky with finding large animals, and for those periods, well, you need to stay strong, and the only way you can do that is by living off fat or stored food. And so the way to kind of buffer against this is just to be somewhat bulkier. So whenever you kill something, you eat as much as you can possibly eat. And if you weigh 10 more kills from this, that's perfectly fine, because you don't know if the next month or so you're not going to be getting any food. So I think that's what this roughly shows. Wikipedia has a list of the world's fattest people, and if you notice something very interesting, if you look at the 10 top countries, these are all Polynesians. And so this is one very small ethnic group which were varying in like wealth and so on, and like colonial history and whatnot, and nevertheless they all end up with massive fertility rates, or not fertility, obesity rates. So clearly there is something about the genetics of these people is why they're up there. So I think it has something to do with the Polynesians are these island hoppers, and so maybe they had a bunch of cold selection because it's cold on boats, or maybe they hunt whales or something in the past, and so relying on whale meat or whatever large animals they were killing. This is an unstable method for getting food, and therefore you need the buffer as explained before. That's my speculation with these. I'd be very happy to hear if someone has some more interesting ones. If you look at the next top 10 here, we see essentially that everybody is a Muslim Arab or these kind of North African people, except for United States, which is the Anglos. And so I think there's something with the desert people too, but I don't know what that might be more specifically. I also think that the Anglos are much more fat compared to the other Europeans, despite very close relationships. And you can just check the numbers if you check the other Anglo countries that are founded by Europeans, especially English people or British people. We have New Zealand at 22, right? Remember that the United States was not number 1, but number 12. And so we have New Zealand at 22, Australia 27, UK 36, this is far above the other Europeans, which are much close related to these countries. If you look, we see that Denmark is quite skinny. I think it even is some of the skinniest in Europe. But even Germans, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, these are all the closest neighboring countries, really roughly to the UK. And UK is very fat, right? There's something about Anglos and being very fat, and I don't know what that is. It seems to be unrelated. It's probably not genetics, right? How could it be genetics if the closest genetic groups who don't seem to live in different climates or anything are not so fat? It seems, I'm guessing something is very bad about Anglo culture. Anyway, the Anglos aside, let's get back to the more important thing, which is of course intelligence. And so for intelligence, you have different GWASs, and there's 3 different ones that relate to intelligence. You have the educational attainment, which is probably Lee et al. The 2018 one. We have the fluid intelligence, and I don't know, that's maybe UK Biobank or something, and then the other intelligence GWAS. So what you see, but you see the same thing because they're highly correlated at the group level. You see that there's not too much pattern. It seems to be going roughly straight here insofar as we can tell, which is not what you expect exactly. There should be somewhat increasing over time in this period too. So maybe we just can't see. Maybe this line is too wiggly because our sampling is too bad or too few people. So not too convinced, but nevertheless, what we see is that roughly from 15,000 to now, there is a positive slope on the evolution. So intelligence has definitely been going up the last 15,000 years, as measured by genetics here. It's clear from all 3 plots. And if we look at depression, it seems to have been going down. So maybe these hunter-gatherers were kind of sad and lonely. And once we got farming, it was all like living in cities and, you know, sex all the time. And who can say? Nevertheless, the pattern shows this. And so it is somewhat, but not entirely consistent with the pattern you get from more ancient history, where you just see more or less a straight line in recent times, right? And even with the brain size shrinking here the last 10,000 years, but we see clearly that the polygenic scores for intelligence have been going up also the last 10,000 years, you see. So my idea here is that there's some selection for smaller bodies, and that is related to smaller brain size, but you can also optimize the brain. Like brain size itself is only correlated, you know, 0.3 or so with intelligence, which if you can square the stuff in your head, this gives you roughly 10% variance. So the remaining 90% variance has to be something else. And so a lot of the brain, well, by far the most of the intelligence differences are not related to overall brain size or skull size when you're approximating from skulls, but it's related to the organization of the brain and like folding and all these kinds of things. And so these things essentially must have improved more than the brain size shrinking would decline intelligence by, right? So this must be offset in this selection. That's my hypothesis, and so we're hopefully at some point we'll figure out some better genetics, and maybe we can test it. That's pretty interesting, and actually this kind of study was actually a scooping of us, because already in 2018 I tweeted the idea of this study. We can see my tweet here. We're building a big compilation of ancient data. So essentially we're trying to do kind of Reich data set. And this is from 2018, so we can check whether these people are going up in intelligence and so on. And we posted a notebook on our pubs that essentially downloaded the Reich data set and scored them for intelligence and looked at the patterns. And you can see that by clicking this link here if you're interested. We also used exactly the same version of data as these people did, the 37.2, which opens the idea that maybe these people, which are, as I recall, mostly a bunch of Chinese people, they actually found our work and just copied it. This is no real evidence of this. It's saying that, well, there's a bunch of other Europeans here, so maybe not. But it is possible that there's some copycat element to this. I will say, though, that I've looked over the Reich files, here, and we can see that if you check the data versions over time, that there are only really 4 different versions over time. And so this first version of the dataset, that one lasted all the way from 219 to 220. So what happened here may be that these researchers started their work somewhere after 2019, and then they got stuck in review for like 2 years, and then they finally gave up and they published at this lower ranking Frontiers journal in 2022. That's my hypothesis. It's more likely than the plagiarism. One last thing that's interesting about this is that it actually replicates this 2007 paper by Woodley et al., Woodley and Piffer, in fact, that looked at an earlier version of a bunch of these old ones. So you can see 217, that was before the Reich dataset. So they compiled some of their own ancient genomics from the public sources, and they did this kind of approach, and they found, well, intelligence was going up, but you can see the p-values they get are terrible. Like you have 0.2 here, and you have the extremely cringeworthy one-tailed 0.04 here. Nevertheless, they were actually correct, even though this was probably p-hacked. So p-hacking does not always mean you're wrong, it just means that your effects are likely inflated. That said, it definitely did replicate, and it was an important forerunner for this other study. Interesting also that this study is not cited by these people. Let's see, Woodley. Nope, it's not cited by them, so, you know, maybe these people are staying away from danger, or maybe they didn't notice this other paper. Who can really say? You have to dig into these authors to check if if there's a reasonable grounds for suspicion of some kind of sneaky stuff. And that's basically this post. Yeah, that's more or less what we have today for ancient genomics. The interesting thing going forward with ancient genomics is that it should be possible to evaluate theories about the fall of Rome, because as I've written about earlier, the fall of Rome might have something to do with eugenics, and that is like kind of Rome had like internal decline. And if you read sources about Rome's decline, you can see that the elite families were dying out. There was a lack of fertility. The emperors even made some fertility laws to promote, to force like elites to marry and have kids, and they just still did not. And so this is very similar to our modern times of kind of indulgence. And so it seems that there may be some analogy here with the Roman Empire. And so since the Romans did not keep proper statistics, we cannot really calculate eugenics and dysgenics in the Roman Empire. At least someone starts calculating, finding a bunch of old graves or something and like computing everything. I've not seen anything, and I've looked around, but if you find something, please post it. Nevertheless, if we get enough old Roman data sets of ancient genomics, we can check whether the polygenic score for the Italians went up and then went down again during the decline of the Roman Empire, as you should expect from this, you know, good times create weak men and so on meme. And this essentially gives you this kind of cyclical dysgenics, eugenics history take that many find somewhat interesting. I also think it's interesting. And I think this would also be very worth testing for other peoples that were once illustrious by world standards. For instance, I'm thinking here of the ancient Greeks, which were essentially full of geniuses, and the modern Greeks are kind of a clientele to the German state, right? And you have the great Persian empires of multiple rounds, so it's possible like Persian genetics went up and then it went down and it kind of went up again. It would all be possible to check this stuff if we can just find enough ancient genomes, and we can make our genetic models good enough to check this. It doesn't have to be intelligence, it can be some other stuff like social cohesion. This stuff will also have a genetic basis to some extent, which eventually you'll be able to predict, and then you can see it back in time, and this will greatly, I think, inform history going forward. And with that said, of course, again, I have some life advice for you here, which you should totally heed, and just don't sue me if it fails, and adios.